So my mother had clearly received a phone call from me at the house, and I was in the house. So she was somewhat consternated about what had actually happened. And she looked down at the rec room from the kitchen where I was playing and gave me that a kind of a look she would give, like what are you up to? And then when my dad came home from work, she said, Ray, something strange happened in the house today. And my dad said, what? And I said, well, I received a phone call from Andy. And he said, so? And she said, but he was in the house. And my dad said, well, so what? And then she said, Ray, we only have one phone. And my dad kind of thought a minute and said, because he was always actively deceiving my mother about the fact that we were literally spending time loops in New Mexico in which that were branches of our ordinary timeline.
Your mother had no idea.
She was actively being deceived constantly by my father. In fact, one time we came back from Curtis Wright an hour before we had left. And my dad checked his watch and realized it and had me go out and play hide and seek. He just asked me to skedaddle. And then when I doubled back about an hour later, my mother was looking around for us. She had been confused about where we had suddenly disappeared to. But my dad had been down in the basement in his carpentry shop, and she had seen me down there. And we had gone to Curtis Wright, but we had arrived back at our home in Morris Plains like an hour before we had left. So, yet we weren't there, so go figure. There was some kind of screw up with timelines, I remember.
Why was he being dishonest to her? I mean, isn't she his wife?
Yeah, she should have known. She certainly knew I was in some kind of specialized learning environment at the elementary school. But they were trying to protect the families by upholding the need-to-know-only basis doctrine vis-a-vis people's wives and other children. I had actually been coached on how to lie to my mother when I was in the project. So
interesting. Did she ever?
So he said to her regarding how she could have taken a phone call from me when I was physically in the house. Well, maybe he ran over to the neighbors and called from there. And she said, no, Ray, that couldn't be it, because right after I hung up, I went to the kitchen and looked down the rec room, and he was down in the rec room. So my dad said something like, well, maybe it was some kind of psychic event or something.
Okay.
So, yeah, so...
Did she ever find out?
I questioned my mother literally on her deathbed in 2003 about whether she knew about the project, and she said yes. Now, I don't know if she was understood at that point that I meant that the project had involved basically non-ordinary experience involving time travel technology, but she certainly knew that she had signed the parental permission slip to put me in the learning lab, that it would involve the administration of medication, and that it was Harvard directed. I think they had deceived her as to what was actually going on.
Well, at least
so I don't think she knew the full gamut. But my sister reminded me that during one of those summers in the early 70s, they had just a knockdown type of argument where my mother actually damaged their bedroom door, slamming it shut. So I think what had happened was that my dad had told her everything. She was outraged that I was involved in something like this.
Did your siblings know?
My siblings certainly had a basis to know, because in my memory work that I did, I recovered the eight anecdotes in which I told them something about the project. Like, for example, when we moved across country in November of 1972, we were driving through southern New Mexico, and my dad turned to my mother in the car and said, "Hon, where should we stop for lunch?" And we were like in Las Cruces or Roswell or someplace way in the southern part of the state. And I leaned forward. Now I was sitting in the back of the station wagon during this part of the trip, because my brother Greg had moved to the jump seat in the far back. And I leaned forward and said, "Dad, why don't we drive up to Albuquerque? Maybe we can have lunch at the La Placida. Maybe Connie will be there." That was his old friend who essentially was his mistress that he was carrying on with when we were on the project in New Mexico. And my sister Cindy turned to me in the car and said, "When were you ever in Albuquerque with Dad, and what's La Placida, and who's Connie?" And I just gave her some stupid answer like, "Well, oh no, I was in New Mexico with Dad in the learning lab." And I think my mother heard that. But if I told her the truth, I would have said, I was in New Mexico with Dad frequently between 1969 and the present because we were teleporting there. I spent 4 hidden summers there in the last 3 years. La Placida is where his long-term friend Connie Chavez works, and Connie is his mistress. They've known each other since 1953. If I told the truth to my sister. But I was still just a little kid. I mean, I was just entering the 6th grade when we moved to California. So I had a very deep and rich experience in the project and with my father, but there was still, some tension in our relationship because he was not giving me any credit for anything. In fact, that's going to be one of the scenes in the movie where I get angry at him and I'm kicking the dirt walking in front of him and Connie, and I say to Connie, he never gives me credit for anything. And we're going to script the fact, even time traveling, even though I'm a little kid, we're going to basically show that, like a lot of parents, my dad really wasn't cutting me any slack. And so we didn't have the most ideal relationship. He didn't fully know how to relate to children.
Did he keep his memories? They never wiped his memory, did they?
No, because when I would ask him things about the project, when my mind would return to our project activities in the 70s and 80s, at different times at the house, he would have a ready answer. So no, he was never brainwashed.
Okay, before we get into more of those kind of questions, did you travel into other places in the future? Other times?
Well, there was the set of jumps via the Stargate at the Surrealist Cultural Center to 2045 to recover the data there and bring it back to the present via the teleport in that building.
What kind of data?
These were the summaries of intervening events. This was the history of the future, so to speak.
The history of the future. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
But before then, when the chronovisor technology was still emerging, we had been trained at Curtiss Wright for a time probe that took place on November 5th of 71. This was about 10 days before my dad and I jumped to 1973. And we wore a crystal helmet and a titanium-coated jumpsuit, like a metal-coated pajamas and boots. And they took us up to a chronovisor array that they had set up in this big research area at the ITT Defense Communications building in Nutley, New Jersey. And instead of about 3 or 4 technicians in the room, there were like 40 people scrambling all over the building. All throughout the whole mission control there. There were military officers in uniform. There were stenographers with stenography equipment. There were engineers like my dad with their pens and slide rules in their left pocket, and so forth. And we were actually physically fastened to these posts on the stage. And they turned the light on, and we had been instructed that there'd be about a half hour of traveling forward. And that when we felt 3 pulses in our forward momentum, we should then look quickly to the left and right, and we would see an object that was the target. And we later found out, when we went back to the learning lab the next day or the next week, I guess it was, that was Friday, yeah, that the target was the Supreme Court building on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and the year was 2013. Now, when we were taken back in time, I was disrobed on the stage. I had my underwear on and some socks, but I was disrobed, and they actually poured my boots out. I had perspired so much. And I walked off the stage. The stage was only about 2.5 feet high. It was just kind of an experimental riser there. And I turned to the facilitator and said, "Where's my father?" Because he had greeted us on the sidewalk when we were walking into the building. In fact, I walked hand in hand with him into the building. And she said, "I'm sorry, Andy, but your dad became overwhelmed.